Hello and welcome to Bow Beats and this Digitakt tutorial and overview of the MIDI tracks. Pretty much the #1 requested video. So I'm sitting here with my cup of coffee. There ain't much left. Obviously I've been working hard with the Digitakt videos. In this video we will be looking at the MIDI tracks of the Digitakt. But I will also explain the jam that you just saw and how I had everything set up on the Digitakt, what it was actually doing, how it was sending notes and CC values and so on. So that's coming in the end of the video. But first I just want to go over the functions. In order to access the MIDI tracks, you press the track button and then you have the 9 MIDI tracks over here. Those are the MIDI tracks. You can't change, for example, #1 here to a MIDI track. Each MIDI track can correspond to one MIDI channel. So for example, if you press track number 13 here, number 13 doesn't have a MIDI channel assigned to it. In order to assign a MIDI channel, you actually go from track 13 here to source. And you can see all these X's over here or crosses. Those means that certain options are disabled. Now it's actually pretty good that they've disabled them, because otherwise it would be very easy to just accidentally touch a knob and change a bank or a program, for example. So from the source button you can access channel, pitch bend, bank, program, aftertouch, mod wheel and breath control. So you press function and the channel button here, for example, to enable it. So now MIDI channel 1 is enabled on MIDI track 13 and we can change it. Now, one really interesting thing here is that bank and program values, for example, as with most of the other values here except channel, can be parameter locked. So I can put down, if I press record here, I enable step mode, I could put down some triggers or some steps here, and I could, for example, lock step number 3 here to a different bank value and to a different program value. Same goes for the pitch bend, for the aftertouch, mod wheel and the breath control. They are all possible to parameter lock. For example, the pitch bend, for example, the aftertouch here, you can see it's when the knob turns yellow here, it means simply that it's parameter locked for that step, and breath control and so on. So whether or not you can use all of these functions depends, of course, on what kind of source you're actually hooking up the Digitakt to. So now we looked at the source. Let's look at the trig page. Now here you have the root key, for example. You have the velocity, you have the length parameter, you have the conditions, and you have the LFO. And this LFO here basically means that you can turn the LFO on and off. So a trigger won't trigger the LFO. Or a step, if you have a note on a step, it won't trigger the LFO, you can turn it off. But you can also, of course, do that per step with the parameter locks. Now all these options here are parameter lockable as well as the notes here. And then you have note 1, note 2, note 3, and note 4. And this is where you do chords. Let me show you. You enable record, you press a step, and if you hold it down here, you can see, the root note here is C5. And we use this button here, and we add number 2 here, so a C, and we have a, I don't know, is it a C, D, yeah, it's a E, and then we add another one up here. So now we have a chord, but of course we can't hear anything because we haven't assigned this channel here to anything. So let's go to source again, let's enable channel, let's pick channel number 2, so now we should be able to hear it. So doing manual step sequencing works really nicely when you want to add chords. But you can of course do live recording as well. So for example, if we enable the metronome here and we enable the chromatic mode here, we can play the synthesizer chromatically. So let's try and record something. And what we can do now is, of course, we can add, for example, extra notes that only trigger a certain percentage of the time. So I've added a step here between 1 and 3. I hold it down, press the trig here, and then on condition, I put, say, 41% of the time. So as you could hear, some of the notes only trigger a certain percentage of the time, and this can really create some interesting grooves. And this makes it so that the 64 steps is in reality a lot more. Now I will do a more detailed video on the conditions because they are very interesting. There are some very interesting ways you can combine different types of conditions because they aren't just percentage based ones. Now let's get over to the CC values because I think that's where kind of where the fun is at. So in order to access CC values, we go under amp to start. Here we have the 8 buttons or 8 knobs here. I always say wrong, I always say buttons. Well, they are technically buttons as well, but the 8 knobs here are corresponding to these 8 graphs here. And here you can pick a CC value. So you can see it goes from 1 to up to 119 for each knob here. Now each knob here, or each value that you set, corresponds to the filter page and these 8 knobs over here. And of course you have to enable them over here. These are enabled by default, and I suppose it's because, yeah, if you set a CC value here, unless you've enabled the knob here, nothing will happen. Now it's good to note that often when you set a value here, you kind of need to set the value so it corresponds to where you were actually at when you made the sound on your synthesizer. Otherwise it's very easy. For example, if you switch to the cutoff, for example here, a CC value that corresponds to the cutoff, and then you have the value at 0 here, when the pattern starts playing, it will start playing at 0 value. So that's good to keep in mind. So you have to set it manually. So let me see if I can add some cool CC values here and show you what they do. So under amp here, ironically under amp, I pick for the first knob here, I pick CC 16 because that corresponds to the amp attack on the Minilog, and under filter here I just enabled this knob here. So let's see how it sounds. And now I've enabled the sustain and the decay of the sound as well. So you can hear all these knobs are turned all the way down, and when I play you can't hear anything, but let's increase the decay of the sound. Now we can put this to good use if we press record here, and you can see that we have the trigs here. Let's add some attack to these trigs here that only comes in to play, say, 40% of the time, and we can add some decay to them as well. And we can add some decay to this sound here as well. And a little less decay to this first one here. And a little less to this one, and a little less to this one. Now instead of parameter locking these changes, you can of course just press record and play in order to record this as automation. But I think you lose a little bit of control when you do that. Now let's try and set up the filter. I think I'll just go with the cutoff for now. I'll show you why I think it's a lot more interesting to parameter lock these changes instead of doing like a sweep. Of course you can do sweeps, but electrons are better with parameter locking. So let's, for example, say we increase this one pretty much and decrease the second one. So now every step has a different value. So let's see how it sounds. I'm pretty sure that you can imagine that you can do a lot of crazy things with this, but I didn't want to focus so much on the sound itself, rather showing you the functions. But you can do some really badass things once you get into the LFO and so on. But let's see here if we can use the LFO here on the LFO section that we haven't talked about in order to affect this sound as well. So we can go into LFO here. So it's a MIDI LFO, and you have all the different sources here. For example, the different the different values for the CC buttons, the 8 CC knobs on the filter here. You have pitch bend, aftertouch, mod wheel, and breath control. So those are the values that you can affect with the CC. Yeah, we'll go for a boring cutoff effect here. Let's see if we can do something with it. So as you can hear, the LFO affects the CC value that we've picked, and you can only have one LFO per MIDI track. But of course, if we set up a duplicate track, for example, you could of course send a new LFO to the same MIDI channel. So that's really important to note. And the options here are basically the same as for the audio channels, the speed, the multiplier, and so on. You have the different wave shapes here as well. So you can imagine you could do some really cool things, and I'll probably demo it more in the future, but for now I just wanted to do a little bit of a quicker overview here. So what was actually happening in the performance that I played for you? Well, let's start with the Moog. The Moog is played from track number 9 and number 10. And this is a little nifty trick that I actually learned from watching Carl Michael's A Cabinet of Curiosities, and he had a great first video on the Digitakt. If you haven't seen it, I'll leave a little link down in the description and a little annotation or card here so you can click it. So what is going on here? Well, on track number 9 here we have an arpeggio. And on track number 10, I've just added a short pattern with 3 notes that have a trig condition. The first note is played once every third time the pattern loops. This one is played once every third, and this one is played once every third. So let's listen. System number 32 doesn't accept CC messages via the MIDI in. Well, I can't really do much more with it. So let's move on to the other pieces. The Minilogue is much more interesting because it can receive CC messages from the Digitakt. So on the Digitakt I have channel number 11 here sending to the Minilogue. And if we take a look here, you can see that there are 2 types of notes here, and I previously mentioned these. The red ones are note trigs, so they will be sending a note value to the Minilogue, and the yellow ones here, or perhaps they look a bit white for you. Well, the yellow ones, they only send some kind of data, for example a CC message or something else that you programmed onto this very step. And I think that overall the Elektron workflow works a lot better if you use these kinds of triggerless trigs, I think they're called, or noteless trigs, than just playing, just recording automation directly into the sequence, because that kind of gives you a little less control. But using these kind of triggerless trigs or noteless trigs makes it so that you have much more control. And if we go through the pages, you can see that every pattern here starts with a note because it's an arpeggio, and the arpeggio is played from the Minilogue, so it's the Minilogue's arpeggiator, but that's where kind of the CC magic comes in. So let's listen to it. So the variation to this arpeggio that you're hearing is actually these noteless or triggerless trigs. If we take a look here, I push it, you can see here up under condition, they are set to a percentage condition, so they won't trigger every time, and there's no note playing. But what they are doing is that they're changing the different CC values that are being sent to the Minilogue. And whenever the sequencer triggers this note, it sends a change to the arpeggiator of the Minilogue, it sends a change to the decay of the Minilogue. It also impacts these 2 buttons here, or these 2 values here, are the rate of the LFO, as well as kind of the depth of the LFO, or int. I'm not sure what it stands for in the middle, but I think you can call it LFO depth as well as the rate of the LFO. So basically under the amp tab here, I've just set it up. So I have 4 knobs sending 4 different CC values. The first one affects the arpeggiator on the mini log itself. It changes the type of arpeggio that is being played. The second one changes the decay of the sound. As you could hear, it was a pretty short sound, but whenever a triggerless trig is activated, the decay is increased. And then we have the third one here affecting the rate of the LFO, and the fourth one here affecting the depth of the LFO. And those corresponds to these 4 buttons here, as I've been talking about earlier as well. And unfortunately for all the circuiteers here, there's really nothing sexy going on the circuit here. We can have a listen. Let's unmute it. There's just some polyrhythmic action going on here. If we check the length here, you can see that the hi-hat tracks here are of a different length, so it gives it kind of a polyrhythmic or polymeter, I'm not really sure which it is, feel to the track. And then there's the bass line on channel number 1 as well. And the circuit is just synced up with clock and transport, so the Digitakt sends the start and stop and the BPM, but it doesn't really affect it in any other way. And I can think that's kind of how I like it. I want as much control on the circuits itself. I don't want too much cross control, but you could of course use the conditional trigs, those the added randomness of conditional trigs, and send, say, MIDI from channel 1 and 2 on the Digitakt to the circuit and create some really interesting randomized grooves. I think that's one way you can use it anyway. So this was a BowBeats MIDI overview video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions, leave them down below. Consider subscribing to the channel, like the video if you like it. And you can always help me out by going to patreon.com/bowbeats and support me over there. So thank you so much for watching.